In the quiet village of Dubova, an old police dog named Hrum walked with a heavy heart each day. People saw his strong body, but few sensed the long pain he carried inside his tired soul. He had served for many long years, and his duty had shaped him into a creature of fear and force. Many villagers kept their distance, and Hrum learned to move like a shadow, with no warm place to rest. But one soft autumn evening, his path crossed with a small girl who did not fear him at all. She looked at him with calm eyes, and her gentle smile touched something deep within him. Her voice was warm and simple, and it moved through him like slow light. In that moment, his life changed. Before we return to the story, tell us where you were watching from, and if this tale speaks to you. In the small village of Dubova, the slow days moved like quiet water, and the old police dog named Hrum watched them with calm eyes that held both memory and pain, because he had seen many hard years and carried them deep in his heart. And the people often sensed that weight, even if they did not know his full story. The village sat between soft hills and wide fields, and the roofs of the houses were faded by many summers, and the air always smelled of grass and wood and old earth. And many older people lived here and walked the same paths every day and spoke in gentle voices that rose and fell like soft wind. Hrum moved through this world with careful steps, and each sound reminded him of something from his long service, because he had been trained to listen, trained to notice, trained to react before danger could rise. He slept under a large linden tree near a wooden bench where some of the elders liked to sit in the afternoons, and he often watched them as they talked about old times and the changes of the seasons, and he tried to understand the peace they felt, because it was a peace he had never learned. But the bench also became a place where small moments gathered around him, and those moments slowly began to open doors inside him, even if he did not know it yet. One quiet morning, the sun rose behind the hills, and the soft light touched the village roofs, and Hrum lifted his head and listened to the distant voices of people beginning their day. He liked these mornings because they felt simple and clean, and the world seemed softer for a short time before memories pushed into his mind again. Many villagers respected him, but kept their distance because they had seen how quickly he reacted when something startled him, or when someone moved too fast near him, and they worried about what old instincts still lived in him. Only a few understood that he did not want to harm anyone. He only did not know how to live without orders or missions or fear. Then came the day when a little girl named Clarka arrived in the village with her mother, who had moved here to care for her elderly father after he fell ill. Clarka was small and gentle, with quiet steps and a bright curiosity in her eyes, and she liked to observe the world without rushing, which made her different from other children her age. When she first saw Hrum under the linden tree, she did not feel fear, only a soft kind of wonder, because she sensed something kind in him, even if his body looked strong and dangerous. She walked toward him slowly, and he watched her with careful attention, ready to pull away if she came too close or made a sudden move. But she did not do anything sudden. She simply sat on the grass near him and looked at the tree above them. She spoke a few quiet words about the shape of the clouds and the sound of the wind, and Hrum listened, even though he did not understand every meaning. But he understood the tone, and the tone was warm and soft and without fear, and this touched something deep inside him. From that day, Clarka often came to the linden tree to sit near him, and she always approached slowly and waited for him to accept her before she came closer. And with each meeting, Hrum felt less tense, and something warm began to grow in him. Villagers noticed this strange friendship, and some smiled, while others shook their heads and said it was not safe. But Clarka did not care, and Hrom felt something like trust building between them, slow and gentle, like the way leaves fall in autumn. One morning, Clarka brought a small drawing she had made for him, a simple picture of a dog standing beside a tree with a small girl holding a flower, and she placed it gently near his front paw and smiled. Hrom looked at the picture and then at her, and something old and heavy inside him softened in a way he had never felt before, and he touched the picture lightly with his nose. Her grandfather, who sat usually on the wooden bench every afternoon, watched this interaction and felt a warm ache in his chest, because he had lived long enough to know that sometimes a wounded heart needs a small act of kindness to find new shape. The wooden bench under the linden tree slowly became a silent meeting place for human stories, and for the story of an old dog who was learning how to breathe in a new way. And the elders often spoke about how life sometimes brings strange friendships that heal deeper wounds than medicine. As days went on, Clarka began to tell Hrom small pieces of her life, like how she missed her old home, how she worried about her grandfather, and how she hoped to make new friends in the village. And even though Hrom could not speak, he listened in a way that made her feel less alone. There were moments when fear came back to him in quick flashes, like when someone dropped a metal bucket, or when a group of boys ran past too fast. And in those moments he tensed and lowered his body as if expecting danger. But Clarka always reached out with her small voice and told him it was all right. And slowly, his breath returned to a calm rhythm. She began to see the shape of his past not through words, but through the way he moved. And she sensed that he carried many long nights and many painful memories. And she understood that he did not know how to live without duty, because duty had been his life for so many years. She told her grandfather that Hrom was not scary. He was only tired and needed someone to show him kindness. And her grandfather nodded, because he too had lived through hard times and knew that kindness can open doors that strength cannot. People in the village slowly changed their view of Hrom as they saw Clarka sitting with him day after day, and they began to understand that behind his strong body there was a heart that had been trained to obey, but had never been taught how to rest. One evening, Clarka brought an apple and placed it near him as a gift, and he nudged it gently, but did not eat it. And she laughed softly and told him he could keep it anyway, and that simple laugh felt like a warm light passing through him. The bench under the linden tree became their daily spot, and sometimes her grandfather joined them and told stories from his long life, and Hrom listened as if the stories were soft blankets laid across old wounds. Through these moments, Hrom began to feel something he had forgotten long ago, a sense that life did not have to be only about danger and commands, that it could also be slow mornings, soft voices, and gentle hands. But even in this calm world, shadows from his past still moved around the edges of his mind, and sometimes he woke at night with a quick breath and tense muscles. But he always remembered Clarka's voice telling him everything was fine, and that memory helped him lie down again. As the season moved toward colder days, the village grew quieter, and more people stayed indoors, and the air smelled of wood smoke and earth. And Hrom walked slowly through the streets every morning, watching over the place with old instincts, but also with new calmness. Villagers began to greet him with gentle words and soft nods, and some older people left small pieces of bread near the tree for him, and he accepted these gestures with humble stillness. Clarka's mother also began to trust him, and one evening she said that some bonds come from the heart and not from fear. And Hrom understood the softness of her tone, even if he did not understand the words themselves. Through these many slow moments, the bond between Clarka and Hrom grew into something strong and quiet, something that touched everyone who saw them together, because it showed that even a wounded soul can find a new path when kindness guides its steps. And all these gentle days became the foundation of what would come later, when danger would rise again, and the village would need courage, and Hrom would need to decide who he truly was and what he wished to protect in the world that was slowly becoming his home. As the days in Dubova slowly shifted toward colder winds and early dusks, the life of the village seemed calm on the surface, yet small currents of unease began to move quietly among the people, because whispers of strange events from nearby towns started to reach them through letters and passing travelers who stopped for water or bread. And even though Dubova was a peaceful place, many felt a slight tremble in the air, like a soft warning under the soil. Hrom sensed this before anyone said a word, because his instincts had never left him, and his ears caught every distant sound, and his eyes followed every movement along the fences and the narrow paths between the fields. And sometimes he stood still for long moments, as if he were trying to hear something hidden far away. Clarka noticed these moments and asked him softly what he was thinking, even though she knew he could not answer with words. But she felt that some old alertness had awakened in him, and her small face tightened with worry she did not know how to name. One afternoon, a letter arrived in the village, and the local postman brought it to the bench under the linden tree where Clarka's grandfather sat. And he opened it with slow fingers and read it aloud with a quiet but steady voice, while Clarka listened closely, and Hrom stood nearby with tense posture. The letter spoke of several break-ins in nearby villages, of windows forced open in the night, of barns emptied, of doors left swinging in the cold dawn. And though no one had been harmed, the meaning behind the words felt heavy and cold, like a stone dropped into still water. People gathered around the bench to hear the message, and their voices grew low and uncertain, because Dubova had not faced trouble like this in many years, and most of the older villagers believed danger had forgotten their small, quiet home. Hrom watched their faces carefully, reading their fear the same way he once read signs on old missions, and something sharp stirred in him, something he did not want to feel again, but could not ignore, because the village had become his place, and these people had become his responsibility, even if they did not fully trust him yet. Later that day, Clarka walked home with her grandfather, and Hrom followed at a steady pace behind them, and she held her grandfather's hand while asking him what the letter meant and whether the strange men from other villages could come here. And her grandfather spoke calmly, but Hrom could hear a tremble beneath his words, because even the old man who had seen many seasons understood that quiet places are not always spared from dark paths. That night, the wind carried the smell of cold metal and wet earth, and Hrom could not rest, and he walked slow circles near the linden tree and listened to the distant creaks of rooftops and the shifting branches, and every sound made him remember nights long ago when he waited for danger to appear without warning. He did not want to fall back into old patterns, yet his body remembered every command and every fear, and he stood alert for long hours, his breath slow but deep, his eyes following the darkness with silent focus. Clarka's mother watched him from the window with a heavy heart, because she sensed he was not restless for no reason, and she whispered that sometimes animals feel what humans cannot see, and she wondered what the night was hiding beyond the hills. As days passed, more small signs appeared around the village, like strange footprints near one barn, missing tools from another yard, a chicken coop door left open even though the owner was sure he had closed it. And these small things added weight to everyone's worry, like water filling a bucket drop by drop. Hrum began to walk new paths every morning, circling the fields and moving along the fences, and people saw him working in silence, and they began to understand that he was not just an old police dog with a broken past, but a guardian who had chosen to watch over them even without orders. Clarka followed him sometimes, always staying at a safe distance, and she spoke to him softly, telling him she trusted him and that he would keep everyone safe because he always knew what to do, even when things were confusing. And her voice helped him hold his calm, even as tension built inside him like a tightening rope. One evening, as the sun fell behind the hills in a deep orange glow, Hrum stopped near the road leading out of the village and lowered his head to the ground, sniffing a scent that made his body go still. Because it was not the scent of any villager, nor any traveler he had met before, but something sharper, colder. The scent of a man who moved with purpose and without kindness. He stared down the empty road for a long time, and though he saw no one, he knew someone had passed there not long ago. Someone watching the village from a distance. Someone waiting for the right moment to step into their quiet world. When he returned to the linden tree, he lay down slowly but did not close his eyes. And Clarka found him there when she came to bring him a small piece of bread. And when she looked at him, she sensed something was wrong, because his eyes were focused not on her, but on something far away. She asked him gently what had frightened him, but he only rested his head on the ground and breathed with slow, deep breaths. And she felt a cold shiver inside her chest, even though she did not understand the reason. The next morning, the village awoke to a broken latch on the old grain shed, and though nothing had been taken this time, the message was clear. And fear moved through the people like a quiet shadow that touched every doorstep. The elders gathered near the linden tree to talk about what to do, and Clarka's grandfather said they should warn all families to lock their doors at night and keep watch over their animals. And others nodded, though their eyes were filled with worry, because they knew they were not prepared for real danger. Through all this, Hrum remained calm on the outside, but inside him, old instincts sharpened like blades. And the villagers finally began to see that he was not dangerous to them, but dangerous to whatever threatened them, and their doubt slowly changed into trust, though some still hesitated to say it aloud. Clarka stayed close to him that day, and she reached out her small hand to touch his fur and told him that whatever was coming, he would face it, and she would not leave him. And something warm moved through him, even as the weight of the unknown pressed harder on his heart. And as night approached again, and the village lights flickered like small stars behind windows, Hrum stood near the edge of the road and listened to the distant woods, knowing that the peace of Dubova was shifting, and that shadows were moving closer, and that this small, quiet world might soon need every bit of strength he had left. The days after the broken latch passed slowly in Dubova, but the air in the village felt different now, because the people no longer walked with the same calm rhythm as before, and even the older men who once sat at the bench under the linden tree now looked over their shoulders more often and spoke in quieter voices. And Hrum watched this change with steady eyes that carried old experience. He moved through the village with more purpose each morning, and the villagers began to follow his movements with a kind of silent hope, because they sensed that he understood something they did not yet see, and they trusted that his body and his instincts were guided by truths they could not grasp. Clarka continued to stay close to him, and her presence gave him calm even when his senses told him danger was near. And sometimes she talked to him about her thoughts and her fears, and he listened with slow breaths that told her he understood more than any dog should. One cold morning she arrived with a small paper in her hand and sat on the ground near him, and she showed him a drawing she had made with simple strokes of her pencil. A drawing of him and her standing together beside the linden tree, with the sun behind them. And when he looked at the drawing, something warm pressed against his old, wounded heart and softened it like morning light on frozen grass. She placed the drawing near his paw and told him it was for him because he protected her and because he made her feel safe even when the village felt strange. And Chrom touched the drawing gently and looked at her with quiet eyes that held deep gratitude. Her grandfather watched from the bench, and his face softened, because he had lived long enough to understand that sometimes a child's kindness can reach places in a heart that nothing else can reach. And he told Clarka that her drawing might be something important one day, something that reminds Chrom who he really is. As the days passed, more strange signs began to show around the village, like tools moved from one place to another, shadows seen near fences, and soft footprints found in the mud near the lower fields where only villagers were supposed to walk. And these small things made people uneasy, even though they tried to pretend nothing was wrong. Chrom felt every shift in the air, as if the wind itself whispered to him, and he walked the outer paths of the village more often and stopped at quiet corners where the earth carried scents of strangers. And each time he lowered his head to the ground, he felt a familiar tension rising inside him like a slow returning storm. He did not want to return to the life he once lived, to the nights filled with danger and orders and fear. But he also knew he could not escape the truth that some things follow a creature no matter how far he walks. Clarka saw this tension in his body and asked him softly if he was scared. But Chrom only looked at her with gentle eyes that told her he was not scared for himself, but for the people he cared about now. One afternoon, a group of villagers gathered near the linden tree to discuss what they should do because more chickens had gone missing and a barn door had been left open again, and they feared someone was watching them from the woods. And some spoke loudly while others whispered, and some argued that they needed to ask for help from towns farther away. Chrom lay beside the tree during their discussion and listened to the sound of their voices. And even though he did not understand every word, he understood the fear behind them, and he knew that fear could make people blind to simple truths. Clarka stepped closer to him and rested her hand on his fur as the adults talked, and she told him she trusted him more than anyone, because he always knew when something was wrong. And he breathed slowly and lowered his head slightly, as if to say, her trust mattered more to him than anything else. That evening, Chrom walked the path near the old barn and suddenly noticed a movement near the shadows, something small but sharp. And he stopped, lifted his head, and looked toward the dark line of trees at the edge of the fields. And though he saw nothing, he felt the presence of someone watching him. He stood still for a long moment, then slowly walked toward the trees, breathing carefully to read the scents carried by the cold wind. And he found a footprint near a fallen branch, a footprint too large for any child, too heavy for any villager, and his body tightened with quiet alertness. Clarka's grandfather found him there moments later, and the old man looked at the ground and whispered that these prints did not belong here, and that they needed to warn everyone. And Chrom looked at him with agreement in his eyes. The villagers gathered again at the bench and spoke about the footprints. And this time, they did not doubt the danger. And even those who once feared Chrom now looked at him as if he were their safest shield. They decided to keep watch through the night, and some of the younger men stayed near the barn with lanterns, while Chrom lay calmly nearby, watching the darkness between the trees. Clarka stayed inside with her mother, but she could not sleep because she knew Chrom was outside in the cold, and she worried for him. And she whispered a quiet hope that he would come back inside the garden fence when morning came. The night was long, and winds moved through the fields with soft whistles, and Chrom remained still for hours, listening to the shifting sounds of the earth and waiting for something to reveal itself. At dawn, he walked the perimeter of the village again and found more signs, small but clear, signs that told him someone had walked near the houses during the night, someone who did not fear being seen. When he returned to the linden tree, Clarka ran to him and wrapped her arms around his neck, even though he was tired, and she told him she knew he had done his best to protect everyone, and he stood there with quiet patience, letting her comfort wash over him like warm water. The people of Dubova looked at Chrom differently now, because they saw that he worked for them without being asked, and even those who once worried about having a trained dog in the village now saw that he was not a threat, but a defender. And slowly, their fear turned into quiet respect. Clarka's drawing remained by the bench, weighted down by a small stone so the wind would not carry it away, and some villagers looked at it each day and felt hope, as if the simple picture reminded them that even dark times could be softened by small acts of love. But beneath this new trust, the tension did not disappear, because everyone knew the danger was still near, moving closer each night, and Chrom felt the weight of what was coming in every breath he took. He knew he would have to face it soon, and even though he did not fear for himself, he feared for Clarka and for the gentle world she lived in, a world he now wished to protect with everything he had left. And as the cold mornings continued to arrive over the quiet roofs of Dubova, he understood that his life was no longer the life of a broken police dog, but the life of a guardian who had found something worth fighting for, something small and warm and kind, something that had changed him forever. And he also understood that soon he would need all his strength to keep that new light safe. The tension in Dubova settled into the daily rhythm of life like a slow and steady shadow that refused to leave. And though the villagers tried to act as if everything was normal, their eyes always drifted to the edges of the fields and the dark line of the woods where the unwelcome prints had been found. And Chrom felt this change in the air every morning as he walked the familiar paths that now felt strangely fragile. He continued to move with calm purpose through the village, and people watched him with new trust and even quiet gratitude, because they understood that his presence made them feel safer. And some of the older men who once avoided him now nodded to him as he passed, their fear replaced by respect. Clarka stayed close to him whenever she could, and she spoke to him softly about her day, about her grandfather's stories, and about how she wished the village could return to the peaceful days they had known. Before the strange signs began, and Chrom listened with slow breaths that told her he cared deeply about her words. One afternoon, Clarka's grandfather brought out an old camera that had belonged to his father many long years ago, and he told Clarka that memories were important, especially in times when fear clouded the mind, because memories could show the truth when eyes failed to see it. And he dusted the lens with gentle fingers while Chrom watched with calm curiosity. He handed the camera to Clarka and told her she could use it to capture moments that mattered, and she smiled with quiet excitement, promising to be careful with it. And she turned to Chrom and held up the camera as if asking his permission to take a picture. Chrom stood still as she pressed the button, and the soft click echoed through the quiet afternoon. And she laughed a little because the picture felt like a gift she had given not only to him, but also to herself. Over the next days, Clarka carried the old camera with her around the village, taking pictures of the houses, the trees, the linden bench, and sometimes the villagers who smiled for her out of kindness. And she began to understand the weight of moments in a new way, because the camera made her see the world through slower eyes. One afternoon, a loud noise came from the lower fields, a noise that made the villagers turn their heads with alarm, and Chrom reacted instantly, sprinting toward the sound with powerful steps, even before anyone understood what had happened. A local farmhand had slipped on a wet slope and fallen into a narrow ditch, and as he tried to climb out, he panicked because the loose soil continued to slide beneath him, and he shouted for help with a trembling voice. Chrom reached him first and lowered himself into the ditch with careful movements, and he pressed his strong body against the unstable soil so the man could use him for support. And the man grabbed onto Chrom's thick fur as he pulled himself up and out of the dangerous spot. But when the villagers arrived moments later, they saw only the chaotic scene and the man gripping Chrom tightly. And for a brief moment, they misunderstood and believed that Chrom had attacked him, and several people shouted in fear. Chrom froze, confused by their reaction, and the man, still shaken and out of breath, tried to speak, but his voice trembled too much to explain what had happened. And the villagers stepped forward with uncertain expressions filled with old fear. Clarka, who had followed the group with her small camera in hand, saw the misunderstanding in their faces and felt a sudden tightness in her chest because she knew Chrom had saved the man, not harmed him, and she desperately looked for a way to show them the truth. She remembered the camera hanging around her neck and quickly raised it to her eyes, searching for any sign she had captured earlier. And she realized she had taken a picture from a distance just as Chrom had lowered himself into the ditch. She ran to her grandfather with urgent steps and told him she had proof that Chrom was helping, not attacking. And her grandfather looked through the picture with careful eyes and felt a deep wave of relief as he understood what it meant. He showed the picture to the villagers, and slowly their fear faded as they saw Chrom's body positioned in a protective way, not an aggressive one. And the farmhand finally managed to speak and tell them that Chrom had saved him from falling deeper. The misunderstanding dissolved like mist under morning sun, and the villagers stepped back with humbled expressions, realizing how quickly fear could twist the truth. And several of them approached Chrom with soft apologies in their voices. Chrom did not move at first, because he was still tense from the sudden shift in the crowd. But when Clarka approached him with calm steps and placed her hand on his head, he took a slow breath and relaxed, trusting her more than anyone. The picture Clarka had taken quickly became a quiet symbol in the village, a reminder that fear can make people blind, and that trust can be built even through confusion. And her grandfather placed the photo near the bench under the linden tree for everyone to see. In the days that followed, the villagers treated Chrom with new kindness, because they had seen his courage and his willingness to act even when no one else was near enough to help. And some began leaving small pieces of food for him near the tree, though Clarka reminded them gently not to overwhelm him. The camera became a tool not only for memories, but also for truth, and Clarka used it to document life in Dubova as it slowly adjusted to the tension surrounding it, capturing smiles, quiet moments, and even small shadows that held meaning. Hrom felt the shift in the village deeply, and he sensed that the people now looked at him as more than a retired police dog with broken memories. They saw him as a guardian of their world, someone who stood between them and the danger that crept closer each night. But even with this new trust, the worry did not leave him, because he knew the footprints near the woods were not an accident, and the cold scent on the wind still carried the presence of strangers who watched the village with unknown intentions. Clarka noticed his silent worry and tried to comfort him with soft words and gentle hands, telling him that they would face everything together and that he was not alone anymore. And Hrom felt her warmth like a small, steady fire in the coldness of his memories. Yet he also knew that danger had its own patience, its own slow steps, and he worried that the quiet days they still had were only a thin wall before something larger broke through. And as he walked through the village on another cold morning, he glanced at the linden tree, at Clarka's drawing held down by a stone, and at the old camera resting on her lap as she waited for him with a small smile, and he felt both hope and warning moving in his heart, like two rivers joining in the same narrow path. The days in Dubova grew colder, and the winds carried sharper scents from the woods, and Hrom felt these changes deep in his bones, because every shift in the air awakened old instincts that had never fully faded, and he knew something was moving closer, even if the villagers could not yet see it. Life in the village continued in a careful rhythm as people tended to their chores and tried to stay brave, but their eyes always wandered toward the tree line where the land dipped into shadows, and they spoke in low voices about the strange signs and the fear that something was watching them. Clarka stayed close to Hrom whenever she could, and she tried to bring him comfort through small smiles and gentle words, but she too felt the unease that had settled over Dubova like a thin blanket that never warmed the skin. One late afternoon, as the sun sank behind the hills and cast long, quiet shadows across the fields, Hrom walked the lower path near the oldest houses, moving slowly with his head low and ears alert. And he paused suddenly when a sharp smell touched his nose. It was not the smell of the villagers, nor of their animals, nor of any traveler who had passed through recently. It was a scent that carried danger, a smell of metal and sweat and cold intent, and Hrom felt his muscles tense in an instant. He followed the scent with careful steps through the tall grass until he reached the back of a small, abandoned shed that had not been used in many years. And there he found marks on the wooden door, marks that looked like someone had tried to force it open. He pushed his nose against the crack in the wood and breathed deeply, and the scent inside the shed confirmed his fear. Someone had been hiding there not long ago, someone patient enough to wait for the right moment. As he circled the shed, his paws pressed against something in the grass, something small and hard, and he lowered his head to look more closely. There, half buried in the dirt, lay a small metal knife with a dark wooden handle, and the moment Hrom smelled it, he knew it belonged to the stranger who had been watching the village. He picked it up gently with his teeth and carried it toward the linden tree where some villagers were gathered, and when they saw him approach with the blade hanging from his mouth, their faces tightened with fear and confusion. Clarka ran to him first, and her eyes widened when she saw the knife, and she called to her grandfather with urgency, because she knew Chrom would never bring something like this unless it meant danger was close. The old man took the knife from Chrom and held it carefully in his hands, turning it slowly as he examined the handle and the edge, and his face grew pale as he understood that this was not a simple village tool, but a weapon carried by someone who did not belong here. Word spread quickly, and soon several men gathered near the tree, speaking in tense voices about what it could mean. One of them suggested that they send the knife to the police in the nearest town so they could investigate it. That night, a local officer came to the village to speak with them, and he examined the knife with serious eyes, explaining that it matched the description of blades used by a group of thieves who had been moving through the region for the past weeks, breaking into homes and barns, stealing whatever they could carry, and sometimes hurting those who got in their way. Hearing this made the villagers grow silent, and several people looked toward their houses with fear as they imagined these strangers moving through the dark woods around them. The officer told them that the group was dangerous and that they were not simple thieves, but men who acted without mercy. And he warned them that they should be cautious, because if the knife was found here, it meant the group had already reached their area. Chrom listened to every word, even if he could not understand the full meaning, but he understood the tone of fear and the smell of danger, and he knew the threat was real. Clarka stood beside him with her small hand resting on his neck, and she looked at the officer with wide eyes, asking quietly if the strangers would come to their village. The officer hesitated before answering, and even though he tried to choose gentle words, Clarka could see the truth in his face, and she felt her heart tighten with worry. After the officer left, the villagers gathered in small groups to discuss what to do, and some wanted to lock themselves inside their homes, while others wanted to keep watch through the night, and arguments rose like storm clouds as fear pressed on all of them. Clarka's grandfather called for them to stay calm and to think clearly, reminding them that panic would only make things worse, and slowly their voices quieted as they looked to him for guidance. Chrom stood in the center of the gathering with steady eyes, and even though he said nothing, his presence gave them courage, because they knew he had sensed the danger long before they understood it themselves. The villagers agreed to take turns keeping watch at night, and they set up small lanterns near the edges of the village to bring some light to the darkness, though the wind often flickered the flames and made the shadows dance across the fields. Clarka walked home with her mother and grandfather and held the drawing she had made for Chrom close to her chest, as if it were something that could protect her from the fear she now felt. And she looked back at Chrom standing near the tree with a heavy heart. That night, Chrom did not rest. He walked through the village with slow steps, stopping at each house and listening for any sound that did not belong. And each time he paused, he could feel the cold breath of danger somewhere beyond the trees. When the moon rose high above the hills, he reached the old shed again and sniffed around the ground where the knife had been found. And though the scent was fading, it was still strong enough to make him growl softly. The night stretched on, and the cold air grew sharper, and Chrom remained awake until the first pale light of morning touched the village roofs, and only then did he lie down beneath the linden tree to rest for a short moment. When Clarka found him there at sunrise, she sat beside him and gently placed her hand against his back, and she whispered that she knew he was tired, and that he had worked hard to protect everyone. And her voice filled him with a warm strength, even as his body ached from the long night. Her grandfather soon joined them and looked down the main path with serious eyes, and he told them both that the knife meant the strangers would likely return, because thieves who scout a place seldom do so without a plan. Hrom looked at the old man and then at Clarka, and he understood in his own way that something larger was approaching, something that would test the village and test him. And he felt the old instinct of duty rise inside him once more. The day moved slowly, and the villagers prepared as best they could, checking the locks on their doors, securing their animals, and keeping their children close. And though fear was present in every heart, there was also a quiet strength in their unity, a strength that had been awakened by the presence of the knife and by the warning carried in Hrom's steady eyes. And as the sun dipped beneath the hills once again, Hrom stood at the edge of the village, his body tall and calm, his breath steady, and his eyes fixed on the dark woods where he knew the strangers were waiting. And he understood that the quiet world he had grown to love was about to be tested in a way none of them had expected. The days after the knife was found brought a quiet heaviness to Dubova, because every person in the village understood that the strangers would not simply disappear. And even the calm voices of the elders carried a tension that had not been heard in many years. And Hrom felt this change with a deep awareness that touched every part of his old, trained instincts. He walked the village paths each morning with slow steps and steady breath, watching the shadows and listening to the wind. And the villagers watched him with a mix of fear and hope, because they knew his senses reached further than their own, and they trusted him in a way they had not trusted anything in a long time. Clarka stayed near him as much as she could, and she whispered to him about her thoughts and fears, and she asked him if everything would be all right, even though she knew he could not answer. And Hrom responded with quiet presence and calm patience that helped her heart feel lighter. The day the village decided they needed a real plan, the elders gathered near the linden tree just after sunrise, and people came from every house with concerned faces and slow steps, and even the youngest stayed close to their parents, sensing that something important was happening. Clarka's grandfather stood near the wooden bench with his hands behind his back, looking at each person with steady eyes, and he spoke with a calm voice that carried through the cold morning air, telling them that fear could not guide their choices and that they needed to think with both caution and unity if they wished to protect their home. The villagers listened quietly because they respected him, and Hrom lay near the tree with his head lifted and ears alert, and his calm presence made people breathe more slowly. One of the younger men suggested they should fortify the old barn that stood near the edge of the fields, because it was the place most exposed to the woods, and others agreed, saying they could store tools and lanterns there and use it as a place to watch from during the long nights. But the roof of the barn was weak, and parts of the walls were worn from years of wind and rain, and they knew they needed a safer place if real danger came. Clarka's grandfather then spoke about the old stone cottage on the far side of the village, a small, sturdy place built by his father long ago, a place that had been used to store farming supplies but was still strong and solid, with thick walls and a lock that could keep out any intruder. But even that cottage felt too small to hold all they needed. Then one woman mentioned the old barn at the north edge, not the weak wooden one, but the larger stone one near the hill, a place that had once been used for grain and tools many years ago, until the roof had been repaired and the lock replaced, and everyone turned to look at it in their minds because they remembered its size and strong beams. Hrom looked toward the hill as if he knew the place they were speaking of, and Clarka tugged at her grandfather's sleeve and asked if that barn could keep them safe. And he nodded slowly, saying it might be the best place to prepare for whatever was coming. And so the villagers agreed to clean the old stone barn and turn it into a safe place where they could gather if danger drew too near, and where they could plan and keep watch. Clarka's grandfather handed a small iron key to one of the younger men, explaining that the key had belonged to his father and had been kept in a drawer for many long years, and the key carried a quiet meaning, because it represented a place that had not been used since older times when the world felt less certain. Chrom followed the men up the hill as they opened the barn door, and the hinges creaked with a deep groan that echoed across the field, and inside they found dust and old tools and the faint smell of dry soil. They cleaned it together throughout the day, sweeping the floor and clearing space near the walls, placing lanterns where they could cast light across the room, and even covering the windows with thick cloth to keep the light hidden at night. Chrom watched everything with careful attention, moving from one side of the barn to the other, as if studying how the place could be used. And when Clarka arrived later in the afternoon with a basket of bread her mother had made, she smiled when she saw him walking through the barn like a silent guardian. She handed out bread to the people working, and her gentle presence softened the tension in their faces, and her grandfather rested his hand on her shoulder and told her she was helping more than she knew. When the barn was finally prepared, the villagers stepped back and looked at it with tired eyes, but also with quiet pride, because they had turned it into a strong place, a place that could protect them if danger came. Chrom stood inside the doorway and looked across the room as if accepting his role in what was to come. As the sun lowered and the light turned soft and golden, Clarka sat beside him and whispered that they would be safe now, and Chrom lowered his head as if agreeing, though he still felt the cold breath of danger on the wind. In the evenings that followed, the villagers brought blankets, small tools, lanterns, and food supplies to the barn, building a sense of readiness, and they created shifts for night watch, though Chrom often stayed awake longer than any of them. Clarka sometimes visited the barn during the day and sat on an old wooden crate with her camera on her lap, taking pictures of the villagers working together, because she felt these moments might one day be important to remember. One night, as cold air wrapped around the village like a thin blanket, Chrom began to feel something heavy in his chest, a sense that danger was not only near, but preparing to move. And he walked toward the linden tree where Clarka's drawing still lay under the stone. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the simple picture of himself and Clarka, and the memory of her soft voice warmed something inside him. The wind rustled the leaves above him, and he sensed movement far beyond the fields, a movement that carried purpose and weight. He lifted his head and stared into the night, and for a moment he felt the same dread he had known in his years of service, the dread that comes when a threat takes its final steps toward a peaceful world. But he also felt something new, something stronger than fear, something born from the trust he had found in this small village, and in the gentle heart of the girl who believed in him more than anyone ever had. And as the first light of dawn touched the hill, Chrom walked back toward the stone barn where the villagers were gathering for another day of preparation, and he moved with a calm resolve, because he knew the time for planning was nearly done, and the time for protecting would soon begin. The night that followed carried a strange stillness through Dubova, a stillness so deep that even the old wooden fences seemed to hold their breath. And Chrom felt this silence like a weight pressing gently against his chest, because he understood that quiet nights often come before the hardest moments. The villagers finished their evening tasks, gathered inside their homes with nervous glances toward the woods, and lanterns flickered behind windows like trembling stars trying to stay alive against the darkness. Hrum walked slowly along the main path, with ears lifted and breath steady, listening for any sound that did not belong, and each shift of wind brought a cold scent that made his muscles tighten. Clarka watched him through her window and whispered a small prayer that he would stay safe, and her grandfather stood behind her with a serious look in his eyes, because he sensed that the woods were no longer empty, and that the shadow moving toward the village had finally made its choice. When the moon climbed high above the hills and cast sharp, pale light across the fields, the first faint crackle of dry leaves reached Hrum's ears, and he lifted his head and turned toward the sound with focused attention. For a moment, the world felt frozen, and then a second sound followed, a soft crunch of footsteps, not made by animals, but by men who moved with careful purpose. Hrum growled low in his throat and began walking toward the edge of the village, and his steps were slow but firm, and the shadows along the tree line seemed to shift in answer. Inside the stone barn, a group of villagers kept watch with lanterns hanging from hooks on the walls, and when they saw Hrum approaching with tense posture, they understood immediately that the time they had feared was now upon them. One of the men reached for the lantern nearest the door, but before he could secure it, a sudden gust of cold wind blew through the open doorway and struck the lantern with sharp force, sending it crashing to the ground where it shattered with a loud crack, and the light inside flickered wildly before dying completely. Darkness swallowed the barn in an instant, and the sudden loss of light made the men gasp and stumble as they tried to regain their sense of direction. Hrum, however, felt no fear in the dark, because he had spent many years moving through shadows and learning how to see with ears and instincts instead of eyes, and the darkness gave him an advantage the intruders could not understand. He stepped inside the barn just as the first figure appeared at the entrance, a man wrapped in dark clothing with a hood pulled low over his face, and behind him 2 more shadows moved with quick, careful steps. The men believed the darkness would hide them, but Hrum had already memorized every sound they made, and he lunged forward with powerful force, knocking the first intruder back through the doorway with a low growl that echoed across the fields. The man fell to the ground with a cry of shock, and his weapon slipped from his hand and clattered onto the stones. The other intruders froze for a moment, not expecting resistance from something so silent and quick, and Hrum used this heartbeat of hesitation to move with precise strength toward the second attacker. He pushed the man into the wall with his shoulder and snarled, and the man dropped the crowbar he had been carrying, and it rolled across the barn floor with a metallic clang. The third intruder tried to slip past Hrum toward the inside of the barn where the villagers were hiding, but Hrum turned sharply and blocked his path, and the man stumbled backward in fear because he saw in Hrum's eyes not wild fury, but trained purpose, the kind of purpose carried only by beings who have known danger for many years. The villagers found their courage and rushed to secure the door, using wooden beams to block the entrance and stop more intruders from coming inside. Outside the barn, more shadows moved along the fields as additional men crept toward the village, believing they could overwhelm the small community with fear and speed. But Hrum stood in the doorway like a living barrier, refusing to let the darkness take what he had vowed to protect. One of the intruders threw a small object toward the barn, something metal that glinted faintly in the moonlight, and it struck one of the lanterns still hanging beside the doorway, shattering the glass and sending pieces scattering across the ground. The sudden burst of sparks briefly lit the interior of the barn before fading again, and in that moment, Hrum saw the fear on the faces of the villagers and the determination in the eyes of the intruders. The battle that followed unfolded not like a loud war, but like a tense dance of movement and instinct, with the villagers trying to defend their home and Hrom using every part of his training to keep them safe. He moved through the barn with quiet, lightning speed, pushing intruders back each time they tried to break through the door or climb through the windows, and the men cursed under their breath because they could not understand how one dog fought with such precision. Clarka watched from the doorway of her home with wide, terrified eyes as she saw shadows moving near the barn and heard distant sounds of struggle, and her mother tried to pull her back inside, but Clarka refused because she could not leave Hrom alone in the darkness. She whispered his name into the night, her voice trembling but full of hope. And though Hrom could not hear her words clearly through the noise of the fight, something in his heart felt her presence, like a quiet flame guiding him. When one intruder managed to slip past the villagers and reached the barn's side entrance, Hrom reacted with a sudden burst of strength, pushing the man to the ground and standing over him with a deep growl that left no doubt he would not allow another step closer. The intruder's courage broke, and he tried to crawl away, but the villagers arrived and restrained him quickly with ropes they had prepared earlier. The leader of the intruders, a tall man with sharp movements and cold eyes, stepped out from the shadows with a small blade in his hand, and he looked at Hrom with a mixture of hatred and disbelief, because he realized the dog had ruined their entire plan. He lunged forward with the blade raised, but Hrom met him head-on with full force, knocking the blade from his hand and sending it sliding across the grass. The man stumbled, and Hrom stood between him and the villagers with a steady growl that rose from deep inside his chest. The man hesitated, then turned to flee toward the woods, but the villagers chased after him, and the sound of running footsteps echoed across the fields until the man disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind the broken remains of their failed attack. When the threat finally faded and the fields grew silent again, the villagers gathered around Hrom with tears in their eyes and voices filled with gratitude, because they understood that without him, the night would have ended in fear and loss. But Hrom did not stand tall in victory. Instead, he lowered his head and breathed slowly, exhausted from the effort and the memories that the fight had awakened. Clarka ran across the field with her small legs carrying her as fast as she could, and when she reached Hrom, she threw her arms around him with trembling relief, whispering that she knew he would protect them. And he leaned gently into her arms, feeling the warmth of her trust. The villagers carried lanterns to light the barn again, and as soft light filled the room, they saw the broken lucerna on the ground, the lantern that had shattered at the beginning of the fight, and they understood that its moment had shaped the entire battle by plunging the intruders into darkness that Hrom could navigate better than any man. And as the night drew to a close, and the first pale light of dawn crept over the hills, Hrom stood quietly among the people of Dubova, not seeking praise or attention, but simply breathing in the calm that had returned, knowing that this night had tested him in ways he had not faced since his years of service, and knowing that he had protected the only world that had ever made him feel truly safe. The morning after the attack arrived with a pale, soft light that spread slowly over the roofs of Dubova, and the village felt different now, because silence no longer carried fear, but a kind of gentle relief, and the people stepped out of their homes with careful steps, as if they were learning how to breathe again. Hrom lay near the linden tree with his head resting on his paws, and his body carried new wounds from the long night. Yet his eyes were calm, because he knew the danger had passed for now, and the village was safe. Clarka ran to him the moment she saw him, and when she reached him, she knelt beside his tired body with tears in her eyes, whispering that she had been so scared for him, and she gently placed her small hand against his fur, as if she were afraid he might fade like a dream. Chrom lifted his head and pressed it against her arm with slow warmth, telling her in his own quiet way that he was still here, and her tears fell into his fur like tiny drops of gratitude. Villagers gathered around them with soft voices, humbled faces, and many of them carried blankets, food, and warm drinks to share. And though they spoke in low tones, the emotions in their eyes said more than their words ever could. One of the older men, who had doubted Chrom at first, stepped forward and bent down slowly, placing his weathered hand on Chrom's shoulder with a shaky breath. And he said that the village owed him more than they could ever repay, and his voice cracked because he understood how wrong he had been to fear him in the past. Clarka reached into her pocket and pulled out a small ribbon she had worn in her hair, a soft fabric the color of morning sky, and she gently tied it around Chrom's front leg, making a simple knot that rested above one of his wounds, and she told him it would help him heal because it carried all her love and all her hope. Chrom looked at the ribbon with deep, quiet understanding, because he knew it was not a decoration, but a promise that he was part of her world now, and that she would stand by him just as he had stood by her. Some villagers knelt beside him with warm hands and soft words, telling him he was brave and strong, and that Dubova would never forget what he had done. And their voices trembled, because courage like his was not something they had expected to witness in their peaceful, small world. As the day moved on, people repaired the damaged barn, cleaned the broken pieces of the lantern, and secured the village once more. But their movements were lighter now, because they no longer felt alone in the face of danger. Chrom watched them with calm eyes, and though his body ached, he felt something new settling inside him. Something like belonging. Something like home. Clarka stayed by his side until the sun began to set, and she rested her head against him, telling him that no matter what happened next, they would face it together. And as the evening light wrapped the village in soft gold, Chrom understood that the long path of fear he had walked through most of his life had finally led him to a place where he was not only needed, but truly loved. And the warmth of that truth settled deep into his tired heart. The weeks after the attack passed more gently in Dubova, and the village began to feel like itself again. But now there was a new layer of quiet strength under everything, as if the land itself remembered what had happened and held the memory with care. And Chrom moved through this changed world with slower steps and softer eyes. The ribbon Clarka had tied around his leg stayed there, faded a little by wind and sun, but still bright enough to catch the light. And people often glanced at it when he walked by, reminded of the night when he stood between them and danger. The police from the nearby town returned several times, following traces left by the fleeing men. And after some days, word spread that most of the thieves had been caught on the road far from Dubova, tired and bruised and angry that their plan had failed in such a small village, and the people felt an even deeper sense of relief, knowing that the threat would not easily return. Clarka listened to these news with wide eyes, and then looked at Chrom and smiled, because she knew in her heart that he had been the turning point, the quiet force that had made the men run instead of stay. The linden tree became once more the center of calm life in the village, and the wooden bench beneath it was rarely empty, for the elders liked to sit there and talk about the past. But now their stories held a new chapter, The chapter of the night when an old police dog reminded everyone that courage does not depend on youth or perfect strength, but on the will to protect what matters. Clarka's drawing of Chrum and the tree was pinned securely to a small wooden board so that the wind could no longer steal it, and her grandfather added the photo she had taken with the old camera, the one that showed Chrum saving the farmhand from the ditch, and together the two images told a simple truth in a way no long speech ever could. Children from the village came to look at the pictures, and they asked questions in small, serious voices, and the elders answered with patient words, explaining how fear can twist what we see, and how trust and attention can untangle it again. Chrum watched them with quiet interest, and though he did not understand every word, he understood the warmth behind them and the way people's voices softened when they spoke about him. And this knowledge settled gently into the parts of his heart that had once been only cold duty. Clarka liked to sit beside him and read little stories aloud from a worn book her grandfather had kept since he was young. And even though she sometimes stumbled over the older words, her voice carried a music that soothed Chrum's tired bones, and he rested his head on her lap as she read, feeling a peace he had never known in his years of service. On some evenings, when the sky turned red above the hills and the shadows grew long and gentle, Clarka's mother would join them and bring warm tea for her father and a small bowl of water for Chrum, and they would talk about simple things like the weather, the harvest, and the small joys of each day. And in those moments, life felt both fragile and strong in a way that only those who have known real fear can fully feel. The stone barn on the hill remained ready, its walls strong and its door secure. But now it was not a place of fear, but a sign of what the village had done together. And sometimes people went there not to hide, but to remember how they had stood as one. Chrum visited the barn from time to time, walking slowly through the doorway and sniffing the air where the scent of danger had long since faded. And each visit felt like closing another page in a book that had once been filled only with hard lines and dark ink. As the seasons shifted, the fields around Dubova changed colors from the pale green of early spring to the deep gold of summer, then to the rust and brown of autumn, and Chrum's fur grew a little whiter around his muzzle, and his steps a little slower, but his eyes still shone with the same deep light when Clarka called his name. She grew taller, her voice steadier, but she never stopped speaking to him with the same gentle respect as when she was smaller. And she often told him that he was her hero, even when he struggled to stand after a long day. On one soft afternoon, when the leaves were beginning to fall from the linden tree in gentle spirals, Clarka brought out the old camera again and asked her grandfather to take a picture of her with Chrum. And they stood together in front of the tree, her hand resting on his side, his head slightly lowered in calm acceptance. When the picture was printed and dry, she placed it beside the drawing and the older photo on the board near the bench. And now 3 images told the whole quiet story: the imagined bond, the proof of his courage, and the lasting friendship that had grown from both. People who passed by often paused to look at the pictures, and then down at Chrum lying peacefully beneath the tree, and they would smile and nod, as if acknowledging that some stories are better felt than told. Chrum no longer needed commands, no longer needed a handler, because his life in Dubova was guided not by orders, but by love. And he knew his duty now was simple: to be present, to watch, to listen, and to stay near the people who had become his family. On the coldest nights, he lay near Clarka's doorstep, his body a silent barrier between her and the world. And even when his joints ached, he did not complain, because he remembered the time when he had nothing and no one to protect, and the memory of loneliness made even pain feel meaningful. And though he could not understand the words the villagers sometimes whispered, words about gratitude, about fate, and about how one old dog had reminded them of their own strength, he understood the tone, the softness, the warmth, and that was enough. In this small village, tucked between hills and fields, and watched over by an aging guardian with a faded ribbon around his leg, life went on, not untouched by darkness, but lit from within by the quiet courage of hearts that had learned to trust again.